The town of Promise was built on a lie, its name carved into a sun-bleached plank above the general store, spoke of verdant fields and a benevolent God. The reality was a pact made with a much harsher deity, the sun. It rained from a pitiless blue sky, baking the single dusty street into a cracked, pale ribbon that stretched between a dozen weary-looking clapboard buildings. The wind was its acolyte, a ceaseless whisper that carried grit into every home, every meal, and every prayer. It scoured the paint from the church steeple and rattled the windows of the saloon, a constant reminder that this land gave nothing easily. What little life there was clung desperately to the shallow, grudging creek that gave the county its name. The people of Promise were much the same, hardened, watchful, and clinging to a rigid code of conduct as if it were the only thing separating them from the vast, unforgiving emptiness that surrounded them. In this town of scrutinized souls, Jesse Kane was a specter. He had arrived 3 months prior, not with the boisterous swagger of a gold prospector or the hopeful gaze of a homesteader, but with a silence as profound and vast as the plains themselves. He was a tall man, built with the broad-shouldered strength of someone who had spent a lifetime wrestling with the earth and with men, but he carried himself with a slight stoop, as if a great weight had settled permanently between his shoulder blades. His face, weathered by sun and shadowed by the brim of a stained hat, was a mask of grim neutrality. Only his eyes, a startlingly clear gray, held any hint of the man within, and they were shuttered, guarded, revealing nothing but a deep, settled weariness. The war had done that to him. He never spoke of it, but the town knew. They saw it in the way his hand sometimes twitched towards a non-existent rifle when a wagon backfired, in the way he positioned himself in the saloon with his back to the wall, his gaze sweeping the room with a practiced, unsettling efficiency. He had been one of Grant's men. They whispered, had seen the bloody fields of Shiloh and the grim siege of Vicksburg. Whatever he had witnessed there, it had scoured him clean of idle chatter and easy smiles. He leased the old Miller place, a forsaken plot of land 2 miles out of town that had already broken the spirits of 3 other families. The house was little more than a shack, its bones warped and groaning in the wind. The barn leaned with a drunkard's despair, and the fields were a graveyard of sun-scorched corn husks and defiant weeds. But Jesse worked. He worked with a relentless, punishing rhythm that seemed to be his only form of communication. From sunup to sundown, the distant, rhythmic thud of his hammer or the steady scrape of his hoe was a testament to his existence. He rebuilt fences, patched the roof, and cleared the stubborn, rocky soil with a singular focus that bordered on mania. He bought his supplies in town once a week, his list short, his words shorter. He'd nod at the storekeeper, pay in coin, and leave. The silence he brought with him trailing out the door like a cold draft. The people of Promise watched him, their suspicion a tangible thing. He was an unknown quantity, a man without a past he was willing to share, and in a town that thrived on shared histories and interlocking gossip, this made him a threat. If Jesse was a specter, Clara Mae Thompson was a ghost, haunting the sunlit world in plain sight. At 28, she possessed a quiet, mature beauty that had once been the town's pride. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned in a neat, sensible bun. But errant curls often escaped to frame a face of striking symmetry. Her eyes, a deep, thoughtful brown, had once sparkled with life and laughter. Now, they were shadowed with a permanent sorrow, the kind that settles deep in the bones. She had been Clara Mae Albright then, the beloved daughter of the town doctor, married to the charming and handsome Elias Thompson. For a few blissful years, they were the golden couple of promise. Then, the guilt had flaked away to reveal the rot beneath. Elias, with his quick smile and easy charm, had a darkness in him, a desperate greed that led him to thievery, and a violent act that had shattered another family and stained the town's name. He died in a prison cell in a larger county, taking his own life before the hangman could. He left Clara with nothing but his debts, his shame, and a name that was now a curse. The town that had once celebrated her turned on her with a righteous cruelty. The women who had been her friends now crossed the street to avoid her, their whispers like the sting of horseflies. The men looked at her with a new, calculating gaze, a mixture of pity and a sordid curiosity, as if her husband's sin had somehow tainted her, made her available. She was the widow of a thief and a brute, a constant, uncomfortable reminder of the darkness that could fester behind a handsome face. Clara endured. She sold the family home and moved into the small rooms behind the shop she now ran, a place that had once been her father's apothecary. She stocked general goods alongside his remedies, flour and beans next to bottles of laudanum and tins of healing salve. Her existence became a small, tightly controlled world of inventory and ledgers, of weighing sugar and measuring herbs. She was polite, reserved, and utterly alone. Her solitude was a fortress, built brick by painful brick, to protect what little was left of her pride from the relentless erosion of public scorn. She saw Jesse Kane on his weekly trips to town. She sold him flour, coffee, and salted pork, their transactions conducted in a shared, almost comfortable silence. She recognized the wall he had built around himself. It was much like her own. But while hers was a defense against the town, his seemed to be a defense against the entire world. The heat of that particular July was a physical blow, a shimmering, malevolent presence that bleached the sky to a milky white and turned the desert into a furnace. It was in this inferno that Lena first appeared, a half-dead creature crawling from the crucible of the wasteland. She was 19, though starvation and terror had carved the youth from her face, leaving behind only the stark plains of her bones and the cavernous darkness of her eyes. She was fleeing a life that had been sold out from under her. Her stepfather, a man with whiskey for blood and ice for a soul, had traded her to a traveling merchant of flesh for a handful of silver dollars and a promise of more to come. The man was taking her west, to one of the booming mining camps where a girl with a pretty face, however terrified, was a valuable commodity. Lena had waited for her chance, a moment of drunken carelessness on the man's part. She had slipped away from their campfire in the dead of night, taking only a small canteen of water, and run. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, her only guide the cold, distant light of the stars. But the desert was a patient monster. It had swallowed her whole. The water was gone by the first afternoon. The sun began to peel the skin from her face and arms. Her throat swelled, and her tongue felt thick and useless in her mouth. She stumbled, fell, and crawled, her world shrinking to the blinding glare of the sand and the deafening roar of the blood in her ears. She was dying. She knew it with a calm, horrifying certainty. She laid her head down on the hot sand, the darkness finally rushing in to offer a reprieve. That was where Jesse found her. He was miles from his farm, tracking a stray calf that had wandered through a break in his newly mended fence. He saw the heap of rags first, mistaking it for a dead coyote. But then, a flicker of movement, a weak, convulsive twitch of a hand. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft sand, his face grim. He knelt, his shadow falling over her. He saw the cracked lips, the blistered skin, the way her chest barely rose and fell. He uncorked his own canteen, and with a hand surprisingly gentle for its calloused size, he lifted her head and let a few precious drops of water fall onto her tongue. Her eyes fluttered open. They were a pale, washed-out blue, wide with a terror so profound it was almost animalistic. She flinched away from him, a dry, rasping sound escaping her throat. She expected a blow, a rough hand, the prelude to the same violation she had been fleeing. Jesse said nothing. He simply poured a little more water into his palm and wet her lips with his fingers. He worked slowly, with an immense, unhurried patience. When he was sure she wouldn't choke, he lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of sharp bones and feverish heat. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, her head lolling against his chest, and turned his horse back towards the derelict farm that was the closest thing he had to a home. For 3 days, the shack on the Miller place became a sick room. Jesse nursed the girl with the same silent, focused intensity he applied to his fields. He spoon-fed her thin broth, bathed her feverish face with cool water, and dressed the raw, weeping sores on her skin with a salve he bought from Clara's store. He moved around the small, cramped room with a quiet economy of motion, his large frame never seeming to loom or threaten. Lena drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind a fever dream of leering faces and rough hands. When she was lucid, she would watch him, her body tensed, ready to fight or flee. But he never spoke, never made a sudden move. He would simply leave a cup of water or a bowl of soup by the cot he'd given her and retreat to his own corner of the shack, or go outside to the endless, back-breaking work that awaited him. A strange, fragile trust began to form in the thick silence between them. He had saved her from the desert. He was not hurting her. For now, that was enough. She didn't know his name, and he didn't know hers. They were two solitary creatures, washed up on the same desolate shore. The whispers started at the mercantile. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife and the town's chief purveyor of gossip, noted with a sharp eye that the quiet cowboy, Jesse Kane, was buying more food than usual. And not just flour and beans. He bought a small tin of peaches, bandages, and the expensive healing salve that only Clara Thompson knew how to properly prepare. "A man living alone has no need for 24 eggs in 3 days," she declared to the small circle of women gathered near the fabric bolts. "And that salve, my Henry used it when his horse threw him. It's for raw wounds." The implication hung in the air, ugly and immediate. A man like that, a man with the war in his eyes, living alone on an isolated farm. It could only mean one thing. He had a woman out there, and no decent woman would be living with a man like that, outside the bonds of matrimony. The whispers reached Clara as a low, persistent hum, another layer to the soundtrack of her ostracization. At first, she dismissed them. It was the town's favorite pastime, spinning webs of sin around anyone who stood apart. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. She thought of Jesse's quiet demeanor, the profound solitude that clung to him like dust. Was it solitude, or was it secrecy? She remembered the salve she had sold him. Her father had taught her to make it. It was for abrasions, burns, wounds left to fester. A cold, righteous anger began to build in her. This was her town, for all that it had scorned her. There were rules. There was a decency to be upheld. She, who had suffered so much for the sins of a man, felt a fierce, protective instinct rise within her. What if there was a girl out there, a runaway, perhaps, or someone he had lured with false promises, a girl being held against her will, suffering at the hands of a man who carried the violence of war in his soul? The thought was a burr under her skin, irritating, then painful, then impossible to ignore. She saw it as a duty, perhaps even a chance at a small, private redemption. She would expose him. She would save the girl and, in doing so, reassert her own moral standing. She waited until late afternoon, when the sun began its long, slow descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. She walked the 2 miles to the Miller place, the dust of the road coating the hem of her dark gray dress. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of fear and determination. The farm was still. The only sounds were the lowing of the single calf in its pen and the creak of the windmill turning lazily in the breeze. The house looked even more dilapidated up close, a testament to the neglect it had endured. Light, weak, and yellow, spilled from a single dirty window. Clara crept closer, her shoes making no sound in the soft dirt. She held her breath, her anger a hot coal in her stomach, and peered through a crack in the weathered planks of the wall. What she saw stopped her heart. The scene inside was not one of violence or debauchery. It was one of quiet, tender ministration. The girl, and she was just a girl, painfully young and fragile, was sitting on the edge of the cot. She wore one of Jesse's shirts, the garment so large it swallowed her small frame, hanging off her shoulders like a shroud. Her pale hair was matted, her face gaunt, but it was her body that made Clara gasp. Her arms and neck were a patchwork of dark, angry bruises and raw, sun-blistered skin. Some of the bruises were old, a sickly yellow-green, telling a story of a pain that had begun long before the desert. Her eyes, fixed on Jessie, were wide with a fear that seemed permanently etched into her features. Jessie was kneeling in front of her. He held a small bowl in one hand and a clean rag in the other. He said nothing. He simply dipped the rag in the water and began to gently, carefully, clean a long, weeping scrape on the girl's shin. His hands, which Clara had only ever seen gripping reins or hoisting sacks of flour, moved with an impossible delicacy. They were the hands of a man who knew how to mend broken things. When the girl flinched, a small, involuntary jerk of her leg, he paused, his hand hovering in the air until she stilled. He met her terrified gaze, and his own gray eyes held not lust or anger, but a profound, aching sadness, a look of shared understanding, as if he were looking at a reflection of his own brokenness. In that single, silent moment, Clara's self-righteous fury shattered like glass. The neat black-and-white narrative she had constructed in her mind, the villain, the victim, the savior, dissolved into 1,000 shades of gray. This was not a predator and his prey. This was something else entirely. This was two wounded creatures, huddled together in the ruins of a broken-down farm, finding a strange sort of solace in their shared silence. Clara backed away from the wall, her movements clumsy, her breath catching in her throat. She felt like an intruder, a profaner of something fragile and strangely sacred. She turned and fled, not walking, but running, stumbling back down the dusty track towards the town. The carefully constructed walls of her own lonely world felt as if they were crumbling. That night, for the first time in years, sleep offered Clara no refuge. She lay in her narrow bed above the shop, the familiar scents of dried lavender and carbolic soap doing nothing to soothe her. Every time she closed her eyes, the image from the shack burned behind her eyelids, the girl's bruised skin, her haunted eyes, and the impossible gentleness in the hands of the silent, war-torn cowboy. It was an image of profound suffering, but also of a quiet, desperate tenderness she had not witnessed in years. It unsettled her, shook her to her very core, and planted a question in her heart that would not let her rest. Who was she to cast the first stone? Sleep was a stranger to Clara that night, replaced by a feverish procession of images. She saw the raw, brutalized skin of the girl, the haunted look in her pale blue eyes, and Jessie's large, calloused hands, moving with the grace of a priest tending to a sacred relic. The righteous anger that had propelled her to his farm had been a simple, clean fire. What she felt now was a tangled, smoky confusion. She had gone to condemn a sinner and had instead borne witness to a strange, silent act of grace. The town of promise, with its rigid pews and ironclad certainties, had never shown her a kindness so profound. When dawn broke, painting the dust-choked sky in fragile shades of rose and gray, a decision had formed in her mind, solid and clear as quartz. She could not simply return to her neat, lonely life behind the counter of her shop, weighing out beans and judgment in equal measure. She could not unsee what she had seen. To turn her back on the two solitary souls in that dilapidated shack would be a sin far greater than any the town gossips could imagine. She moved with quiet purpose through her store, her footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn stillness. She filled a sturdy wicker basket not just with food, a fresh loaf of bread, a slab of bacon, a half-dozen eggs, but with the tools of her true trade. She selected a jar of her own calendula salve, known for its ability to soothe burns and prevent scarring. She added a tightly wrapped bundle of dried willow bark for fever, a bottle of harsh-smelling carbolic acid for cleansing deep wounds, and clean linen for bandages. Lastly, she tucked in a small, worn copy of a primer, its pages softened by the hands of countless children her father had treated. It was an afterthought, a hopeful instinct she didn't fully understand. Carrying the heavy basket, she slipped out the back door before the town began to stir, a fugitive from her own carefully constructed solitude. The 2-mile walk felt different this time. The land was no less harsh, the sun no less demanding as it climbed the sky. But Clara's perspective had shifted. She was no longer an avenging angel, but a petitioner, though for what she wasn't sure. Jesse was outside, splitting logs with a fierce, rhythmic economy of motion. The axe rose and fell, each thud a punctuation mark in the vast silence. He saw her coming when she was still 100 yards away, a dark figure moving steadily through the shimmering heat. He stopped his work, the axe held loosely in one hand, his body tense and watchful. He did not move forward to greet her, nor did he turn away. He simply stood there, a pillar of sweat-stained flannel and denim, his face an unreadable mask under the brim of his hat, and waited. Clara's steps faltered for a moment. What was she doing? What right did she have to intrude on this fragile world he had created? But the memory of the girl's eyes propelled her forward. She stopped a few feet from him, the basket handle digging into her arm. "I brought some things," she said, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the open air. "For the girl, salve, and food." Jesse's gaze flickered from her face to the basket and back again. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned and walked to the cabin door, pulling it open. He didn't invite her in. He simply created a space for her to enter, a silent, momentous concession. He held the door and stepped back, his message clear: "I will not stop you." Clara entered, her eyes taking a moment to adjust to the dim interior. The shack was cleaner than she'd expected. The floor swept, a few meager possessions tidied away. The girl, Lena, was on the cot, curled into a tight ball, her face turned to the wall. She flinched when the light from the open door fell upon her, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. "It's all right," Clara said softly, directing the words more to herself than to the terrified girl. "I'm not going to hurt you." Jesse remained outside, the rhythmic thud of the axe resuming its steady beat, a distant percussion to the quiet drama unfolding within the cabin. Clara set the basket down and approached the cot as one would a frightened colt. "My name is Clara," she said. "I brought something for those burns. It will help." Lena said nothing, but Clara could see the tremor that ran through her small frame. Over the next hour, Clara worked with a patient, practiced gentleness that was the legacy of her physician father. She cleansed Lena's wounds, her touch light, her voice a low, soothing murmur. At first, Lena recoiled from every touch, her body rigid with a deeply ingrained fear of human contact. But Clara was persistent. She spoke of simple things: the weather, the way to properly steep willow bark tea, the stubbornness of the local soil. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand a name or a story. She simply offered a quiet, capable kindness, slowly, painstakingly. The tension began to leak out of Lena's body. She allowed Clara to treat the worst of her wounds, her breathing evening out, the wild terror in her eyes softening to a wary watchfulness. That day set the rhythm for the days that followed. Clara would arrive in the morning, and Jesse would grant her the same silent permission to enter. He would work outside from sunup to sundown, wrestling a living from the unforgiving land, his labor a constant, furious battle against decay. He was rebuilding the barn, shoring up its collapsing frame with new timbers hewn from the cottonwoods down by the creek. His sweat and toil were slowly, visibly, raising the place from the dead. Inside, Clara waged a similar war. She cleaned the shack until it was spotless, chasing out years of dust and grime. She cooked proper meals on the small, rusty stove, the scent of baking bread and simmering stew filling the small space. A radical act of domesticity in a place that had known only neglect. And she tended to Lena. A strange, unspoken alliance formed between the three of them. They were an island of silence and shared purpose in a world that had cast each of them out. They rarely spoke. Words seemed inadequate, clumsy things, unequal to the task of bridging the vast chasms of their individual pains. Instead, they communicated through action. Jesse would leave a bucket of fresh water by the door each morning. Clara would ensure a hot meal was waiting for him at dusk. And Lena, as her physical strength returned, began to emerge from her shell. She started by performing small tasks, folding the linen, stirring the stew, her movements hesitant and shy. She followed Clara like a shadow, watching her with a silent, intense curiosity. One afternoon, Clara took out the primer. She sat with Lena at the small, rough-hewn table and opened it to the first page. "A is for apple," she said, pointing to the letter. Lena stared at the page, her expression a mixture of fear and a desperate, hungry yearning. She was 19 years old, and the written word was a language as foreign to her as Chinese. Patiently, Clara guided her hand, showing her how to trace the shape of the letter. They started with the alphabet. Lena's brow furrowed in concentration as she whispered the sounds back to Clara. They moved on to simple words, scratching them out with a piece of charcoal on a spare shingle. It was painstaking work, but in it, a powerful bond was forged. For Lena, each letter learned was a small piece of the world she was reclaiming. For Clara, teaching Lena was an act of profound connection, a way of mending a brokenness in another that she could not fix in herself. Sometimes, Jesse would pause in the doorway on his way in from the fields, his face grimy with dirt and sweat, and watch them for a moment, his gray eyes holding a look of quiet approval before he would retreat to wash at the pump. They existed in a delicate, fragile balance, a three-legged stool that could only stand with all of its parts intact. But the human heart is not a simple machine, and soon, fissures of a more complicated nature began to appear in their quiet world. One night, the wind turned, bringing a sudden, unseasonable chill down from the high plains. It rattled the shack, finding every crack in the walls and pouring through in icy drafts. Clara, who now often stayed late, was mending one of Jesse's shirts by the weak light of the lantern. Lena was asleep on the cot, but she was shivering, her dreams troubled. Jesse sat watching the fire in the stove, his broad back to the room. Clara saw him notice Lena's shivering. There was only one spare blanket, and it was thin and worn. He stood up, and for a moment, Clara thought he was going to add more wood to the stove. Instead, he unbuttoned his own thick flannel shirt. He pulled it off, revealing a back corded with muscle and crisscrossed with the pale, silvered lines of old scars. They were the marks of war, a map of past agonies. He walked over to the cot and gently, so as not to wake her, laid the heavy shirt over Lena's shivering form. Clara's needle stopped mid-stitch. A sharp, unexpected pang of jealousy shot through her, so intense it was like a physical pain. It was the intimacy of the gesture, the giving of his own warmth, the nearness of his body to hers. It was a purely protective act, and yet it felt like something more. But as quickly as the jealousy came, it was washed away by a different, more powerful wave of emotion. It was the sheer, unadorned goodness of it, this broken man, who had so little, giving what he had to protect this broken girl. Tears pricked at the corners of Clara's eyes, hot and sudden. She turned her head away, ashamed of both the jealousy and the overwhelming tenderness that had followed. She was falling for him, she realized with a terrifying certainty, not just for his strength or his quiet presence, but for the profound, wounded kindness she had just witnessed. The fissures deepened a week later. Clara had taken to wandering the arid hills behind the farm in the late afternoons, searching for the wild herbs her father had taught her to identify. It was a peaceful ritual, a time for her to be alone with her own tangled thoughts. She was reaching for a cluster of yarrow near a rocky outcrop when the rattler, coiled and silent in the long shadows, struck. The pain was instantaneous, a searing white-hot fire that shot up her calf. She cried out, stumbling back, and saw the snake slither away into the rocks. 2 small, dark puncture wounds were already beginning to swell and discolor on her ankle. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She knew the venom worked fast. She was at least a mile from the house, and her leg was already beginning to feel numb and heavy. She tried to walk, but the limb buckled beneath her. She fell, her head hitting the hard ground, the world beginning to spin into a gray, fuzzy haze. It was Jesse who found her. He'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of her comings and goings, and when she didn't return by dusk, a cold knot of dread had formed in his stomach. He'd set out to find her, his long strides eating up the ground. He saw her crumpled form near the rocks and broke into a run. He knelt beside her, his face a grim mask of concern. He saw the bite instantly. There was no time to get her back to the house, no time for poultices or tinctures. There was only one thing to do. Without a word, he pulled a knife from his belt and made 2 small, shallow cuts over the puncture wounds, connecting them. Clara cried out, a weak, thin sound. Then he lowered his head and put his mouth to her ankle. Clara's world contracted to that single, shocking point of contact, the rough scrape of his beard, the heat and pressure of his mouth on her skin. It was an act of such raw, primal intimacy that it transcended all propriety, all fear. He was drawing the poison from her, taking it into himself to save her. He spat the venom-laced blood onto the ground, his face strained, and then pressed his mouth to her skin again. The world faded in and out for Clara. She was aware of the strength in his hands holding her legs steady, of the fierce, desperate focus in his eyes when he looked up at her, of the undeniable fact that this silent, distant man was tethering her to life with his own body. When he was done, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He carried her back to the farm, her head resting against the solid wall of his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart, smell the scent of earth and sweat and clean pine that clung to him. In that moment of complete vulnerability, she felt a sense of safety so profound it made her want to weep. Jesse never touched them, not in the way a man touches a woman he desires. He built his walls high and thick, but his love, for that is what it was becoming, seeped through the cracks in small, undeniable ways. It was in the way his gaze would follow Clara as she moved about the cabin, a quiet, intense watchfulness that made her skin tingle. It was in the single, perfect wildflower he would sometimes leave on the table beside Lena's primer. It was in the extra log he'd put on the fire when he saw one of them shiver. These small, silent acts of devotion were more powerful than any flowery declaration. They were the language of his heart, and both women were becoming fluent in it. They were both falling for him, and they both knew it. An invisible, humming wire of tension now connected the 3 of them, a complex current of affection, rivalry, and a deep, shared understanding. Clara felt as if she were being torn in 2. The nights were the worst. She would lie awake on the small pallet she'd made for herself by the stove, the memory of Jesse's mouth on her skin a burning ember. She wanted him with a fierce, elemental ache that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had been a widow for so long, a ghost in her own life. Jesse made her feel alive, solid, real. But then she would look over at Lena, asleep on the cot, her face peaceful in the moonlight. She saw not a rival, but a child who had finally found a safe harbor. Lena looked at Jesse with an unguarded, worshipful adoration. He was her savior, her protector, the first man in her life who had ever shown her kindness without a price. How could Clara, in good conscience, act on her own desires when it could so easily shatter this fragile girl's newfound peace? The thought of causing Lena more pain was unbearable. She wanted to protect Lena from the world, but the greatest threat to her heart, Clara realized with a sickening lurch, might just be Clara herself. The delicate balance finally broke on a hot, breathless night at the end of summer. A fever had taken hold of Lena, a lingering effect of her ordeal in the desert. She was delirious, tossing and turning on the cot, murmuring names and pleas from a past she had never spoken of. Her small frame was racked with violent shivers, despite the oppressive heat. Jesse sat on the edge of her cot, wiping her brow with a cool, damp cloth. His face was etched with a deep, helpless concern. As Lena's shivers intensified, he did the only thing he could think to do. He gathered her up, blanket and all, and held her against his chest, trying to soothe her with his own steady warmth and solid presence. He rocked her gently, his calloused hand stroking her matted hair, whispering wordless sounds of comfort. It was the gesture of a father, of a brother, of a guardian. Clara watched from the shadows of the far wall. She saw only a man holding the woman he was protecting, the woman they both, in their own ways, loved. All of her roiling emotions, her fierce desire, her sharp jealousy, her deep, protective love for Lena, her guilt, crested into a single, painful wave. She saw the future in that moment. She saw Lena's young, fragile heart being given to this powerful, silent man who was already burdened by his own ghosts. She saw the potential for a sorrow so deep it would swallow the girl whole. She stepped forward, her voice a raw, trembling whisper in the silent cabin. "You'll break her, Cowboy." The words hung in the air, a terrible, fragile truth. Jesse didn't stop rocking the girl in his arms. He didn't offer a defense or a denial. He simply lifted his head and looked at Clara, and his eyes, for the first time, were utterly unguarded. In their gray depths, she saw it all, the immense, crushing weight of his own loneliness, his desperate fear of causing more harm in the world, and a silent, agonizing acknowledgement of the impossible love that was growing between the three of them. His look was a confession, a plea, and a shared sentence. It said, "I know." The fragile quiet of the farm could not hold against the rising tide of gossip from the town. A secret is a heavy stone, and promise was too small a pond for its ripples not to touch every shore. It began, as most things did, with the sharp-eyed pronouncements of Mrs. Gable at the Mercantile. "Twice a week now. Clara Thompson makes that walk," she'd observed, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that carried easily over the rustle of calico. "And she doesn't come back until dusk. A respectable widow, spending her days at the farm of a man like that, and with that other one out there." The other one had no name. She was a phantom, a creature of speculation. Some said she was Cain's simple-minded sister, hidden away for shame. Others, their eyes gleaming with a more sordid excitement, swore she was a captive, a girl from a saloon in a bigger city that he'd stolen away. The truth, whatever it was less important than the story. And the story that took root was the most scandalous one of all. Jesse Cain, the silent soldier, was living with two women. The stares that had once followed Clara, laden with pity and scorn for her husband's sins, now changed. They became sharper, more prurient, filled with a fresh and eager condemnation. When she walked down the dusty street, conversations would cease, replaced by a thick, knowing silence. The women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now watched her pass with narrowed eyes and tight, unforgiving mouths. They had branded her. She and the phantom girl were the Cain women, a term spoken with a delicious shiver of moral outrage. The whispers eventually solidified into an official verdict, delivered by Reverend Miller himself. He came to her shop one afternoon, his long, somber face set in lines of grim duty. He stood stiffly before her counter, the scent of dust and piety clinging to his black coat. "Clara," he began, foregoing any pleasantries, "the town is talking. It is my duty, as your spiritual guide, to warn you. You are on a perilous path." Clara finished weighing a small bag of coffee beans, her movements deliberate and calm. "A path to where, Reverend?" "To ruin," he said, his voice dropping low. You are a widow, a woman whose name is already burdened. To associate so openly with a man of Mr. Kane's solitary and violent reputation is folly. To be a party to the arrangement he has out there with that other girl, it is an abomination in the eyes of God and man. Clara looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. She thought of the cold stone of his church, the hard wood of the pews, the rigid certainty of his sermons. Then she thought of the ramshackle farm, of Jesse's scarred back as he shielded Lena from a draft, of Lena's fierce concentration as she learned to form the letter B, of the profound, unspoken kindness that filled the silences between them. "What do you suggest I do?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Leave them," the Reverend said, his certainty absolute. "Leave that place. Return to your station. Show the town you have not forgotten your decency. It is the only way to save what is left of your reputation. God is merciful to the repentant. Clara." A small, bitter smile touched Clara's lips. She had spent years cowering before the town's judgment, living a half-life of penance for a crime that was not hers. She was done. "My reputation was destroyed by my husband's deeds and this town's memory. Reverend, there is nothing left to save, and I have found more of God's mercy in that broken-down shack than I have ever found in your church." Reverend Miller recoiled as if she had struck him. A dark flush crept up his neck. "You are choosing sin. Then you are choosing to live in defiance of all that is moral and right." "I am choosing kindness," Clara replied, her voice firm. "You should try it sometime." He turned and left without another word, the small bell above the door jangling furiously in his wake. Clara knew, with a sinking finality, that she had just drawn a line in the sand. She had officially chosen her side. The farm was her home now. The town was a foreign country. The world outside their small island of three was about to crash in on them in a far more brutal fashion than mere gossip. It arrived in the form of a man on a dusty roan horse, a man whose smile didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. He sat his horse at the edge of the property for a full day, simply watching. His presence was a violation, a predatory stillness that set the hairs on Clara's arms on end and made Jesse's hand stray unconsciously to the axe he was using to mend a corral fence. Lena saw him and froze. The color drained from her face, leaving it a waxy, translucent white. The tin cup she was holding slipped from her fingers and clattered to the dirt. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. It was him, Silas Croft, the man her stepfather had sold her to. Clara rushed to her side. "Lena, who is that?" But Lena couldn't speak. She could only stare, her body trembling with a violent, ague-like tremor. The man, seeing he had been noticed, nudged his horse into a slow, arrogant walk toward the house. Jesse moved to intercept him, placing his large body between the stranger and the two women. "This is private property," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "State your business." Silas Croft grinned, a flash of yellowed teeth in a sun-beaten face. He ignored Jesse and fixed his gaze on Lena, who was now half hidden behind Clara. "Well now, look what the wind blew in. I've been looking for you. Girlie, my property. You ran off before our business was concluded." He let his eyes rake over her, a slimy, proprietary look that made Clara's stomach clench with disgust. "She's not your property," Jesse said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. "You need to leave, now." Croft's grin widened. He finally looked at Jesse, then let his gaze slide over to Clara. "Oh, I see. Got yourself a new arrangement. Have you? Found yourself a big, tough fella to hide behind. And a friend, too. That's cozy. But a deal's a deal. That girl owes me. Either she comes with me, or you pay me what she's worth. And she's worth a considerable sum, I assure you. A pretty, unbroken thing like her." The word unbroken was a lie, a piece of cruel salesmanship, and it hung in the air with a vile stench. Lena let out a choked sob. a sound of pure, animal terror. That sound was the breaking point. Something in Jesse, some tightly coiled restraint that had held for years, snapped. The violence that came was not the hot, brawling anger of a saloon fight. It was the cold, efficient, and terrible violence of a man who had been trained to kill. He moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. One moment, he was standing still. The next, he had crossed the space between them. He reached up, grabbed Silas Croft by the front of his shirt, and ripped him clean out of the saddle. Croft hit the ground with a grunt of surprised pain. Before he could recover, Jesse was on him. There was no shouting, no cursing. There was only the sickening, percussive sound of fists hitting flesh and bone. Jesse hit him with a controlled, methodical fury. A lifetime of repressed rage and grief and horror pouring out through his knuckles. He was not just fighting a man. He was fighting every ghost that haunted him, every injustice he had ever witnessed. He was destroying the past that had hurt this girl, this small, fragile piece of life he had sworn to protect. Clara screamed his name, but he didn't hear her. He was lost in the red fog of battle. It was only when Croft lay limp and bloody in the dust, moaning, his face a ruined mess, that Jesse finally stopped. He stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands raw and bleeding. He looked down at the man he had broken, and then he looked at his own hands, a dawning look of horror on his face, as if he didn't recognize them. The sheriff arrived less than an hour later, summoned by a passing farmer who had witnessed the end of the brutal beating. Silas Croft, despite his injuries, was able to croak out his version of the story. A simple business dispute that this wild man Cain had escalated into a murderous assault. It was his word against the silence of Jesse, who offered no defense at all. They put him in irons. The metallic click of the cuffs locking around Jesse's wrists was the loudest sound Clara had ever heard. He looked at her, and at Lena, who was weeping uncontrollably. His face was a mask of grim resignation, but his eyes were filled with a desperate, unspoken apology. He had tried to protect them, and in doing so, he had doomed them. As the sheriff led him away, he left a silence behind him that was heavier and more terrible than any before. The sun began to set, bleeding color across the sky. But inside the shack, a deep, cold darkness had fallen. For a long time, neither Clara nor Lena moved. They were frozen, two statues of grief and fear. The protector was gone. The walls of their small, safe world had been breached. Then, Clara felt a small, trembling hand slip into hers. It was Lena. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond her own past. It was a fear for the future, for Jesse. "He's gone," Lena whispered, her voice cracking. And then, for the first time, Clara broke. The composure she had maintained for years, through shame and scorn and loneliness, crumbled. A great shuddering sob escaped her, and she pulled Lena into her arms, holding on as if she were the last solid thing in a world that was dissolving around them. Lena clung back, her small frame shaking. They knelt there on the dirt floor of the empty shack and wept together, for the man they had lost, for the peace that had been shattered, for the terrifying uncertainty of what was to come. They were no longer a widow and a girl, a teacher and a student. They were two women united by a shared, desperate love. After the storm of tears had passed, Lena looked up at Clara, her eyes shining with a fierce, newfound resolve. "Don't you leave, Clara," she pleaded, her voice trembling but firm. "Please, don't you leave, too." She took a ragged breath, and the words that came next pierced Clara's heart. If I die, he will be so sad." In that moment, Lena was no longer thinking of herself. She was not afraid of Silas Croft, or the town, or even of death. Her greatest fear was causing Jesse pain. Clara looked at the young woman she'd come to love like a sister, and she knew she could no more abandon her than she could cut out her own heart. A cold, hard clarity settled over Clara. Weeping would not bring him back. Fear would not protect them. Action was required. She stood up, her face set. "I won't leave," she promised. "And we are going to get him back." The next morning, Clara walked into town and sold her shop. She sold the building, the stock, the fixtures, and the small apartment upstairs where she had lived her lonely life. She sold her father's apothecary jars and her mother's rocking chair. She liquidated her entire existence for a sheaf of banknotes, leaving herself with nothing but the clothes on her back and the money in her purse. She took the next stagecoach to the county seat, a larger town with a proper courthouse, and she hired the best lawyer she could afford. 3 days later, she returned. The lawyer, a shrewd, sharp-eyed man named Mr. Abernathy, had worked quickly. He'd argued self-defense, pointed out Silas Croft's unsavory reputation as a known rogue, and paid a hefty bail that left Clara with almost nothing. Jesse was released late at night, a formality to avoid stirring up more talk. He stepped out of the dark, musty jailhouse and into the cool night air. A free man, but one who looked 10 years older. And there, waiting for him in the pale moonlight across the street, were Clara and Lena. They were standing side by side, their shoulders touching. As he watched, Lena reached out and took Clara's hand, and Clara squeezed back. They stood there, holding hands, their faces pale and anxious, a silent, unshakable unit. When Jesse saw them, his weary face broke. He saw what Clara had sacrificed. He saw the new strength in Lena's eyes. He saw that they had not fallen apart in his absence, but had instead forged themselves into something stronger. He walked across the street, and the three of them stood there for a long moment, the unspoken emotions between them a tangible, humming force. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The pretense was gone. They were no longer three separate people living under one roof. They were a single, indivisible thing. The walk back to the farm was a silent pilgrimage. They were living on borrowed time. The trial was still weeks away, but for now, they were together. The breaking point came a week later, on a night when the sky itself seemed to be weeping. A massive thunderstorm rolled in. A torrent of wind and rain and percussive thunder that shook the little shack to its foundations. The rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. Leaking through the roof Jesse hadn't yet had time to fully repair. Inside, the mood was as dark as the storm. Jesse had barely spoken since his return. He was consumed by a quiet, simmering despair. He had brought this trouble upon them. His violence, the very thing he had tried to bury after the war, had risen up and threatened to destroy the only good thing in his life. He sat at the table, his head in his hands, the thunder outside a pale echo of the storm raging within him. He was close to collapsing under the weight of it all. Clara watched him, her heart aching. She saw the tremor in his broad shoulders, the utter defeat in his posture. She crossed the room, the floorboards groaning under her feet, and came to stand behind him. She laid her hands on his shoulders, her touch tentative at first, then firm. She began to knead the hard, knotted muscles, trying to pour her strength, her love, her reassurance into him through her fingertips. He didn't pull away. Instead, a low, ragged sound escaped him, the sound of a man who had held on for too long. He reached up and covered her hands with his own, clinging to her as a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. At that moment, Lena, who had been huddled on the cot, rose and came to them. She stood before Jesse, her young face full of a wisdom far beyond her years. She reached out and gently took his free hand, her small, smooth fingers lacing with his large, calloused ones. She brought his hand to her cheek, holding it there, her eyes closing as she offered her own silent comfort. And so they stood, a tableau in the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the fury of the storm. Clara behind him, her hands on his shoulders, a pillar of strength. Lena before him, her hand against his face, a vessel of tender grace. The air was thick with unspoken confessions, with a love too powerful and too strange for the world to understand. The barriers they had so carefully maintained, of propriety, of fear, of self-denial, were washed away by the rain and the darkness. Jesse slowly raised his head, looking from Lena's face to Clara's. His eyes filled with a raw, desperate need. There was no resisting it anymore, no turning back. In the heart of the storm, they finally, irrevocably, came together. The dawn that followed the storm was unnervingly quiet. The sky, washed clean by the torrent, was a pale, wounded gray. The air smelled of damp earth and shattered pine needles. Inside the shack, the world had been remade. The charged, humming energy of the night before had dissipated, leaving a silence that was heavier and more complex than any that had come before it. For Clara, it was the silence of damnation. She rose before the others, her movement stiff and furtive in the dim light. Every nerve in her body screamed a single, damning word: transgression. She looked at the sleeping forms, Jesse on his pallet, his face finally smoothed of its torment, and Lena on the cot, curled in a peaceful sleep deeper than any Clara had yet seen her achieve. And she felt a wave of self-loathing so powerful it threatened to drown her. She was the serpent in this fragile Eden. She, the older one, the worldly one, the one who should have known better. She had taken this broken girl's sanctuary and sullied it with her own selfish, worldly desires. She had seen Lena's fragile heart, her pure, worshipful love for Jesse, and she had walked right into the middle of it, a thief in the night. The thought of what she had done, of the line she had crossed, was a physical sickness in her gut. She had not only broken God's law and man's, she had broken the sacred, unspoken trust that had formed between the three of them. She had destroyed Lena. Her course of action was immediate and absolute. She had to leave. It was the only penance possible. She would remove herself, the poison, from their lives. Perhaps, in her absence, they could heal, could find their way back to that simple, protective bond she had so selfishly corrupted. Moving with the silence of a ghost, she gathered her few belongings, a spare dress, her hairbrush, and bundled them into a small shawl. She left the primer on the table, a painful reminder of a life she was now abandoning. She did not dare to look at Jesse or Lena again. A single glance would shatter her resolve. She slipped out the door into the damp, chilly air, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She did not have a destination. She would simply walk, away from the farm, away from the town, away from the wreckage she had made, until she could walk no more. She had made it perhaps a quarter of a mile down the muddy track, her boots sinking into the wet earth, when she heard a cry behind her. "Clara, wait!" It was Lena's voice, thin and desperate against the vast, empty landscape. Clara's first instinct was to run, to flee the confrontation, the accusations she knew she deserved. But her feet were rooted to the spot. She turned slowly, her heart pounding with a dull, painful rhythm. Lena was running toward her, stumbling in the mud, her bare feet heedless of the sharp stones. She wore only the large shirt she slept in, her pale hair a wild tangle around her face. She was crying, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her eyes held an expression not of accusation, but of sheer, terrified panic. She reached Clara and threw herself into her arms, clinging to her with a desperate strength that belied her small frame. "Don't go," she sobbed, her face buried in Clara's shoulder. "Please, Clara, you can't go." Clara's own tears began to fall, hot and bitter. She tried to gently push Lena away. "I have to," she choked out. "Lena, you don't understand. What I did, what happened, it was wrong. I've ruined everything." "No!" Lena pulled back, her small hands gripping Clara's arms, her gaze fierce and impossibly clear. "You don't understand. You didn't ruin anything. You saved me." Clara stared at her, uncomprehending. "Saved you? I've hurt you more than anyone." "No," Lena insisted. shaking her head so violently her hair flew. All my life, men have been a fear, a pain, something to run from. Even with Jesse. I loved him for saving me, but I was always a little afraid of his size, of his strength, of what a man is. She took a shuddering breath, the words pouring out of her in a raw, honest torrent. Last night, in that room, with both of you, for the first time in my whole life. Clara, I wasn't afraid. I felt whole. I felt safe, truly safe. She looked at Clara, her pale blue eyes shining with a profound and startling wisdom. "He needs you," she said, her voice dropping to an intense whisper. "I see how he looks at you. You're his strength. You're the part that's as strong as he is. I'm the part he needs to protect. He can't have one without the other. It would be like trying to live with only half a heart." She clutched Clara's hands, her grip beseeching. "I want him to have a whole heart. Clara, I want him to have both of us." The simple, staggering truth of her words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. She had been so consumed by her own guilt, by the world's definition of sin, that she had completely failed to see what had truly happened. It had not been an act of destruction, but one of creation. In that storm-tossed shack, something new and strange and beautiful had been forged between them, a love that defied all names and all laws. Just then, a figure appeared, walking toward them from the farm. It was Jesse. He had pulled on his trousers but was barefoot and shirtless, his hair damp and disheveled. He stopped a few yards away, his face a mask of anguish as he took in the scene. Clara with her bundle, Lena pleading, both of them in tears. "Don't go, Clara," he said, his voice raw with a pain that seemed to be ripped from the very core of him. "Please." "I can't stay. Jesse," Clara whispered, her resolve wavering. "It isn't right. You have to choose." He took a step closer, his gray eyes pleading with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Choose," he repeated, the word sounding like a foreign concept. "How? How can a man choose which lung to breathe with? How can he choose which hand to lose?" He looked from Clara's face to Lena's and back again, his own eyes filling with a helpless, desperate moisture. "I was a dead man walking when I came to this place. You, both of you brought me back to life. If either of you leaves, you take that life with you. I can't live without you, Clara, and I can't live without you. Lena, I don't know how." It was the longest speech she had ever heard him make. It was a confession, a declaration, and a sentence, all in one. He was not asking them to choose. He was telling them that for him, there was no choice. They were his life, both of them. And in that moment, standing in the mud under a vast, empty sky, the three of them made a silent, momentous decision. They would not be governed by the world's rules. They would be governed by the truth of their own hearts. Clara dropped her bundle. Lena let out a watery, relieved laugh, and Jesse stepped forward, gathering both of them into his arms, holding them in a fierce, protective embrace as the sun finally broke through the clouds. They would live together. It was not a decision spoken aloud, but a truth they all settled into, as naturally as the creek settled into its banks. They did not try to define what they were to each other. They simply were. In the privacy of the small shack, they were a family, their days and nights interwoven in a complex tapestry of shared labor, quiet affection, and a startlingly peaceful intimacy. Outside the walls of the farm, they presented a united, if unspoken, front. But their peace was a fragile bubble, and the sharp edges of the world were closing in to burst it. The town of promise, fueled by the Reverend's righteous fury and Silas Croft's venomous lies, had worked itself into a lather of moral indignation. Their scandalous arrangement was an affront, a slap in the face to every decent, God-fearing family. It could not be tolerated. The vigilantes came at dusk a week later. They were not men in masks, but the familiar faces of the town, Farmers, the blacksmith, the clerk from the general store. There were a dozen of them, their faces grim and set in the flickering light of the torches they carried. They were led by Reverend Miller, his Bible held aloft like a weapon. Jesse, Clara, and Lena were sitting on the porch step, watching the fireflies begin to dot the twilight, when they heard the rumble of the wagon and the angry murmur of voices. Jesse stood up instantly, moving to place himself in front of the women. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice low and hard. "We're staying with you," Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. Lena stood beside her, her hand clutching Clara's, her face pale but resolute. The mob stopped at the edge of the yard, their torches casting long, dancing shadows that made them look like demons. "Jesse Kane," the Reverend shouted, his voice ringing with theatrical authority. "We have come in the name of the Lord to cleanse this den of iniquity. You have befouled this community with your sin and your filth. Send out the women, and we will deal with you as you deserve." "There's no sin here, Reverend," Jesse called back, his voice steady. "Only a family. This is my land. You have no business here." "This is God's land," the blacksmith roared, stepping forward and brandishing a heavy hammer. "And you are defiling it. We've come to tear this devil's nest down, board by board." With a collective roar, the mob surged forward. Jesse met the first two men with his fists, the skills of war returning in a cold, brutal flood. He fought with a desperate strength, not to win, but to protect what was behind him. But he was one man against 12. They swarmed him, bearing him to the ground with sheer numbers. The blacksmith's hammer landing a glancing, brutal blow to his ribs that made him cry out in pain. While some men held Jesse down, others stormed the porch. They grabbed Clara, her screams lost in the roar of the mob. One of the farmers, a man she had known her whole life, ripped the front of her dress from collar to waist, a deliberate act of public shaming. They were about to drag her off the porch when Lena, with a cry of pure rage, launched herself at the man, scratching and biting like a cornered wildcat. They seized her easily, her small frame no match for their brute strength. They dragged her, kicking and screaming, into the middle of the yard and threw her to the dirt at the Reverend's feet. "Behold the wages of sin," the Reverend intoned, raising his arms to the sky as Lena lay weeping in the dirt. It was at that moment that the sheriff arrived, drawn by the light and the noise. He rode into the yard, his shotgun held across his saddle, his face a mask of weary disgust. "That's enough," he yelled, his voice cutting through the din. "Let him up! Disperse, all of you, before I start making arrests for riot and trespass." The mob, faced with the authority of the law, hesitated and fell back, their righteous fury curdling into sullen resentment. Two men let go of Jesse, who staggered to his feet, clutching his side, his face bruised and bleeding. His eyes scanned the yard, wild with panic, until he saw them. He saw Clara, clutching the torn remnants of her dress to her chest, her face stained with tears but her eyes blazing with defiance. He saw Lena, a small, dirt-streaked heap on the ground. Ignoring his own pain, he stumbled across the yard. He went to Lena first, kneeling and gently helping her to her feet, his hands brushing the dirt from her hair. Then he turned to Clara, pulling her to his other side. He wrapped his arms around both of them, holding them tight against his injured body, shielding them from the hateful stares of the townsfolk. He stood there, a wounded, bloody, and utterly unbowed patriarch, flanked by his women. The sheriff dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. "What in God's name is this, Kane? I've had nothing but trouble from this farm since you arrived. You need to explain this situation, now." Jesse looked the sheriff square in the eye. He didn't look at the mob or the Reverend. He looked at the law. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried across the yard with the clear, ringing authority of an unbreakable vow. "There's nothing to explain." "Sheriff," he said, pulling Clara and Lena even closer, They are my wives." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a declaration so bold, so far beyond the pale of what they could comprehend, that it stunned them into silence. The sheriff stared at the trio, at the man holding his two women as if he had a right to them. He rubbed his tired eyes. There was no law in the territory against a man claiming two wives. Not really. It was a matter for the church, for society, not for his jail cell. There was no crime he could arrest them for, but he had a yard full of men who had just committed assault. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. He turned to the mob. "You all heard the man. This is his family. This is his property. The law has no say in it, and neither do you. Get off his land. Now, all of you." Grumbling, defeated, the mob broke apart, melting back into the darkness from which they had come, their torches sputtering out one by one. In the sudden, ringing silence, the three of them stood alone in the wreckage of their yard, clinging to each other. They had won the battle, but the consequences were absolute. The town of Promise would never forgive them. They were now completely and utterly cast out. In the weeks and months that followed, they were treated not just as outcasts, but as though they did not exist. When Clara and Lena went to town for supplies, they always went together now. They were met with a wall of impenetrable silence. The storekeeper would serve them, but would not meet their eyes or speak a word. The other patrons would turn their backs. They were ghosts, invisible in the town that had once been their home. But in that profound isolation, they found a strange and resilient freedom. With nothing left to lose, they poured all their energy into the farm. They were no longer just surviving. They were building a life, together. They finished rebuilding the barn, its new sturdy timbers a testament to their shared labor. They planted a large garden, and the unforgiving soil, tamed by their relentless efforts, yielded a surprising bounty of corn, squash, and beans. They bought more livestock with the last of Clara's money, and the farm began to look less like a ruin and more like a home. One day, a wagon carrying a family of homesteaders broke an axle on the road near their farm. The father was dead of fever, and the mother was too weak to go on. She had 3 small, hollow-eyed children. Jessie repaired their wagon, and Clara Dem and Lena nursed the woman and fed the children. When the mother died 2 days later, they did not send the orphans to the mercy of the town. They buried the mother on a hill overlooking the creek, and they took the children in. Wordlessly, their family of 3 had become a family of 6. The laughter of children now filled the small shack, chasing out the last of the ghosts, surrounded by the silent scorn of the world. On their small patch of hard-won land, Clara, Jessie, and Lena began to find a profound and lasting peace. The autumn bounty, so hard-won from the stubborn soil, was a brief and golden reprieve. Winter did not creep in that year. It fell upon them like a judgment. The first blizzard came early, a screaming white fury that buried the fences and moaned around the corners of the shack for 3 solid days. When it passed, it left behind a world transformed, silent, pristine, and brutally cold. The sky became a permanent, unforgiving slab of gray iron. The creek froze solid. The very air grew thin and sharp, each breath a painful reminder of the season's hostility. With the cold came the sickness. It started in the outlying homesteads, carried, some said, by a lone trapper passing through from the north. They called it the lung fever. It began with a cough, progressed to a debilitating fever that stole the senses. And for many, it ended in a final, rattling breath as their lungs filled and failed. It moved without regard for piety or sin, striking the home of the blacksmith as easily as that of the town drunk. Promise, which had so proudly cast out its sinners, was now besieged by a far more democratic and merciless foe. Panic was the first symptom to spread through the town. Neighbor turned away neighbor for fear of contagion. Reverend Miller preached sermons about divine retribution, but his prayers did not stop the fever from taking his own youngest sister. The town's doctor, an elderly, overwhelmed man, was soon exhausted, his meager supply of quinine and laudanum doing little to stem the tide. It was into this landscape of fear and death that Clara, Jessie, and Lena stepped. They were pariahs, ghosts in the town society, but the specter of death made old hatred seem a petty luxury. The first to come to them was the farmer who had torn Clara's dress. He arrived at their farm in the dead of night, his face a mask of shame and desperation. His wife and 2 of his children were sick. The doctor wouldn't come out again. He had no one else to turn to. Clara looked at the man, at the raw terror in his eyes, and saw not an enemy, but a desperate human being. There was no hesitation. "Show me the way," she said. That night, their small, isolated farm became a bastion against the plague. A new rhythm, born of grim necessity, took hold. Jessie became the legs and arms of their operation. He loaded their small wagon with firewood he had spent the autumn splitting, with blankets from their own beds, and with the food they had so carefully preserved. He would drive Clara to the stricken homes, his silent, powerful presence a strange comfort in the sick rooms. He was not afraid. He had seen death on a scale these people could not imagine, and his stoicism was a rock for the terrified families to cling to. He would haul water, stoke fires, and sit with the dying, offering a quiet companionship when there was nothing else left to give. Clara was the mind and the heart, the knowledge her father had bequeathed her, once a source of quiet pride, now became a vital weapon. She moved through the quarantined homes, her face calm and focused, the scent of antiseptic herbs clinging to her clothes. She brewed teas from willow bark and elderflower to fight the fevers, made poultices of mustard seed to clear the lungs, and forced nourishing broths down the throats of the sick. She was tireless, her competence a force of nature in itself. The town that had scorned her as a sinner now whispered her name with a new, desperate reverence. And Lena, who could not go with them for fear of bringing the sickness back to the 3 orphan children they now sheltered, became the anchor. The shack was transformed into an apothecary's workshop. From dawn until late into the night, she worked. She ground herbs with a mortar and pestle until her arms ached, steeped tinctures in the precious alcohol Clara had saved, and rolled beeswax and healing salves into neat portions. She cared for the children, telling them stories and keeping their fears at bay, ensuring the life of their home, the heart of their strange family, continued to beat. She would have a hot, nourishing meal ready when Jessie and Clara returned, their bodies aching with fatigue, their faces etched with the sorrows they had witnessed that day. For the first time, Lena was not the protected, but a protector in her own right, an indispensable pillar of their 3-person army. They worked this way for weeks, a seamless unit bound by a shared, unspoken purpose. They saved more than they lost, their tireless efforts a small but significant dam against the flood of death. They asked for nothing in return, and the town, in its shame and gratitude, began to leave offerings on a stump at the edge of their property. A sack of flour, a cured ham, a bolt of wool flannel. It was a silent, grudging apology, an admission of a debt that could never be spoken aloud. Clara, however, was not made of iron. She pushed her body to its limits, ignoring the deep, persistent weariness that settled into her bones. She told herself the shivers were just the cold, the slight, dry cough a result of the smoky sick rooms. She was the strong one. She did not have the luxury of being ill. The fever took her on a Tuesday, with the sudden, brutal force of a physical blow. One moment she was measuring out dried comfrey root with Lena. The next, a wave of dizziness so profound hit her that the world dissolved into a black, spinning vortex. She collapsed to the floor, the ceramic bowl shattering beside her. By the time Jessie carried her to her bed, she was already burning with a terrifying heat. The sickness she had fought so bravely in others had now invaded her own body with a vengeance. Her cough became a deep, ragged bark that tore at her lungs. The fever climbed, and she descended into a world of delirium. her mind a fever swamp of disjointed memories and terrifying phantoms. She cried out for her father, argued with the ghost of her dead husband, and sometimes, in moments of lucidity, she would stare at Jessie with wide, unrecognizing eyes, a stranger in her own home. Jessie's world shrank to the confines of that small, dim room. He did not leave her side. The town, the farm, the world outside, it all ceased to exist. There was only Clara. He nursed her with a fierce, desperate single-mindedness that surpassed even the intensity of his work on the land. He bathed her burning skin with snow-melted water, forced spoonfuls of broth and medicine between her cracked lips, and held her strong, solid body down when the fever dreams made her thrash. Lena took over everything else. She cared for the children, managed the farm, and prepared every remedy and meal, her face a pale, taut mask of worry. She would bring Jessie food, but he would not eat. She would plead with him to rest, but he would not sleep. He just sat there, a silent, unmovable sentinel, watching Clara's every ragged breath, his own life seemingly tied to hers. In the long, terrible hours of that vigil, as the blizzard raged outside and Clara raged with the fever within, something inside Jessie was stripped bare. He had loved her. He knew that. He had desired her body, admired her strength, cherished her companionship. But as he watched her fight for her life, he realized the true nature of his love was something far deeper, something he had never had the words to articulate. He thought of the first time he'd seen her in her store, so self-contained and proud amidst the town's scorn. He thought of her marching out to his farm, full of righteous anger, only to have that anger melt away in the face of compassion. He remembered her hands, so capable, as she taught Lena to read, as she set a broken bone on one of the orphan children, as she stood beside him against the mob, her torn dress a flag of defiance. He realized he loved Lena with a desperate, protective tenderness. She was the embodiment of the innocence and gentleness that the world, and the war, had tried to destroy. She was the part of his heart that was soft, the part that needed to be shielded. To love Lena was to protect a fragile, beautiful thing. But Clara, he loved Clara with a kind of reverence. She was not fragile. She was strong as he was, perhaps stronger. She had faced down her own ghosts, her own private war, and had emerged not broken, but tempered like steel. She was his equal. She was the anchor that held him to the earth, the compass that gave his life direction. She was the part of his heart that knew how to fight, the part that refused to break. To love Clara was to stand beside a force of nature. To lose her would be to lose not just a companion, but the very ground beneath his feet. The thought of a world without her in it was a vast, black, and terrifying emptiness. On the third night, Clara's breathing grew shallow, each inhalation a painful, rasping struggle. Her skin was a translucent, waxy gray. She was losing. Jessie could feel her slipping away, and a cold, primal terror, the likes of which he hadn't felt even in the bloodiest battles, seized him. He knelt by her bed, took her limp, hot hand in his, and rested his forehead against it. A silent, desperate prayer of a man who had long ago stopped believing in prayer. Lena came to stand beside him, placing a gentle hand on his trembling shoulder. She had watched him for 3 days, had seen the raw, naked terror in his eyes, and she understood. There was no jealousy in her heart, only a deep, aching sadness and a profound, selfless love for them both. She reached down and placed her own cool, smooth hand over Clara's fevered one, sandwiching it between her own and Jessie's. She leaned down, her voice a soft, tear-choked whisper meant only for the unconscious woman before them. "You have to fight, Clara," she pleaded. "You have to come back. He can't do this without you." She paused, her own heart breaking with the truth of what she had to say. "I know you're his heart, Clara, the part that makes him strong, the part that makes him fight. I'm just I'm the part he needs to keep safe. He can't be whole without his heart." Whether it was her words, or the touch of their combined hands, or simply the turning of the tide, something shifted. Clara's breathing, which had been so faint, seemed to deepen, a flicker of movement behind her eyelids. Jesse and Lena stayed like that for hours, a human chain pouring their combined will and love into the woman who connected them both. And slowly, miraculously, the fever began to recede. The raging heat in her skin lessened to a damp warmth. Her breathing eased, losing its ragged edge. Clara woke in the pale, watery light of dawn. She was weak, her body feeling like a hollowed-out reed. But her mind was clear. The first thing she saw was Jesse, slumped in the chair beside her bed, his head on his arms, finally asleep. The second thing she saw was Lena, asleep on a pallet on the floor, her hand still resting on the edge of Clara's mattress, as if to keep her tethered to the world. A weak, grateful smile touched her lips. She was home. When Jesse woke and saw her eyes open, clear and lucid, watching him, a sound broke from his chest, a raw, ragged sob of pure, undiluted relief. He lunged forward, not with passion, but with the desperate gratitude of a man who had just been given back the world. He gathered her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, his powerful shoulders shaking. He, who had faced down war and mobs and death without flinching, wept like a lost child who had just found his way home. Lena woke at the sound, and seeing Clara awake and Jesse weeping, she scrambled to the bed. Jesse reached out his other arm, pulling her into the embrace, and the three of them clung to each other. Their tears, of relief, of sorrow, of a love too vast and complicated for words, mingling together in the quiet dawn of a new day. Spring arrived as a miracle. It came on a soft southern wind, melting the iron-gray snow and breathing life back into the frozen land. The creek broke free of its ice with a great, cracking roar. The stark, skeletal trees began to blush with the pale green of new buds. And then, in a sudden, riotous explosion of color, the wildflowers bloomed. The fields and hills around the farm were transformed into a rolling carpet of Indian paintbrush, bluebonnets, and yellow primrose. On the first truly warm afternoon, when Clara had regained her strength, the three of them walked out into the fields together. The orphan children ran ahead, their laughter like bells on the warm air. For the first time in a long time, there was no sickness, no fear, no fight. There was only the warmth of the sun, the scent of the flowers, and the profound peace of their survival. Jesse stopped in the middle of a meadow awash with blue flowers. He looked at Clara, and then at Lena. He reached into his pocket and pulled out two small, simple rings. They were not made of gold or silver. He had carved them himself from the hard, resilient wood of an Osage orange tree that grew by the creek, the same tree that had shaded them on hot summer days. He had sanded them until they were perfectly smooth and polished them with beeswax until they shone with a soft, warm luster. He took Clara's left hand. "Not by the law of any man," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he slid a ring onto her fourth finger. "By the law of this land, which has sheltered us, by my heart, which is yours." Then he turned to Lena and took her hand. "Not by the words of any preacher," he said, sliding the second ring onto her finger. "By the truth of this family, which has saved us, by my soul, which is yours." There was no church, no congregation, no official piece of paper. But as they stood there in the middle of the wildflower field, the sun warming their faces, their hands finally and forever joined. It was the most sacred wedding the world had ever known. They were bound not by a law they didn't recognize, but by a covenant they had forged themselves in the crucible of hardship, sorrow, and a love that had defied all reason to blossom in the most unforgiving of soils. The peace they had forged was a living thing, a garden tended with daily acts of love and labor. The farm thrived under their combined hands. The orphan children, once hollowed out by loss, grew round-cheeked and loud with laughter, their roots sinking deep into the new, strange, and loving soil of this unconventional family. The town of Promise kept its distance, but the silence was no longer one of active hostility. It was a grudging, watchful quiet. The family on the Miller place were no longer sinners. They were an enigma, a testament to a resilience the town could neither understand nor deny. The past, however, is never truly buried. It is merely a seed lying dormant, waiting for the right conditions to break ground. It arrived on a brilliant summer afternoon in a polished black buggy, drawn by a pair of handsome bays that were profoundly out of place in the dusty landscape. The man driving the buggy was stout and prosperous, dressed in a fine wool suit despite the heat. His face was fleshy and self-satisfied, and as he drew to a halt at the edge of their property, his eyes swept over the rebuilt barn and the tidy fields with an appraising, proprietary air. Clara was on the porch, showing one of the children how to string beans. When she saw him, the string of beans slipped from her fingers, scattering across the wooden planks. The blood drained from her face. It was a face she had not seen in 7 years, a face that haunted the darkest corners of her nightmares. Mr. Alistair Harrison, a land speculator from the county seat, a man who had been her husband Elias's business partner in a venture that had ended in ruin and death. Jesse was coming in from the fields, his shirt soaked with sweat, a scythe resting on his shoulder. He saw the buggy, but more importantly, he saw Clara's face. He had never seen that particular look on her before, a bone-deep terror mingled with a cold, ancient hatred. He dropped the scythe and was on the porch in 3 long strides, his body instantly positioning itself between Clara and the stranger. Harrison tipped his hat, a gesture of condescending politeness. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice as smooth and oily as his hair. "It has been a long time. I see you've landed on your feet." His eyes flickered over Jesse, then to Lena, who had appeared in the doorway behind them, her face pale and questioning. "What do you want, Harrison?" Clara's voice was a low, tight wire of controlled fury. "Business, my dear. Always business," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I've recently acquired the deeds to several properties in this county. Delinquent taxes. You understand, it seems this little plot, the old Miller place, is among them. I've come to inspect my new acquisition." "This farm is under lease to me," Jesse stated, his voice flat and hard. "The paperwork is filed at the county office." Harrison chuckled, a rich, unpleasant sound. "A lease, my good man, is a temporary arrangement, easily dissolved when the property changes hands. But I am a reasonable man." He looked directly at Clara, his smile turning venomous. "Perhaps we can come to an arrangement. For old time's sake, I'm sure you wouldn't want any unpleasantness. No need to dredge up the past. Is there?" The threat was unmistakable, a poisoned dart aimed at the heart of Clara's hard-won peace. This man was not just after the land. He was here to erase her, to silence the last living witness to his own crimes. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara finally told Jesse and Lena the whole story, the parts she had kept locked away even from herself. Elias, her husband, had not been a simple thief. He had been a pawn. He and Harrison, along with several other wealthy men from the county seat, had been involved in a scheme to swindle homesteaders out of their land claims. But someone had made a mistake, and the fraud was about to be exposed. A scapegoat was needed. Elias, charming and trusting and already in debt, was the perfect choice. They had fabricated evidence, paid witnesses to lie, and threatened him, telling him that if he didn't take the fall, the crime they would pin on him would be far worse than theft, a crime so vile it would destroy his family's name forever. They framed him for both, ensuring his conviction and his silence. Trapped, shamed, and terrified for Clara, Elias had taken his own life in his cell, leaving Harrison and his partners free and clear. Clara's voice was devoid of emotion as she recounted the tale, a litany of pain recited until it was numb. He was a weak man, she finished, staring at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. But he wasn't evil. They made him a monster so they could hide their own sins. I have lived with that shame, that lie, every day since. Lena knelt and put her arms around Clara, her own eyes wet with tears. Jesse stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, his jaw set like granite. He was silent for a long time. When he finally turned, his gray eyes were burning with a cold, clear light. "No more," he said. The two words were an iron vow. "You will not live with it another day. This ends, now." Jesse was a man of the earth, a man of action, not of law, but he understood the nature of power. Harrison's power came from his wealth and the lies he had built around himself. Their only weapon was the truth. "We fight him," Jesse declared. "Not with fists, with the law." He rode to the county seat the next day and used the last of their savings to retain Mr. Abernathy, the same shrewd lawyer who had freed him from jail. He was no longer just defending his lease. He was filing a lawsuit against Alistair Harrison for wrongful prosecution, conspiracy, and the deliberate defamation that had led to the ruin of Clara's name and the death of her husband. The trial became the talk of the county. It was a spectacle. The poor, scandalous widow from Promise taking on one of the territory's wealthiest men. The courtroom was packed on the first day. The people of Promise were there in force, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and ingrained hostility. Harrison sat with his expensive lawyer, looking confident and unruffled, greeting his associates in the crowd with smug nods. Jesse, Lena, and the three children sat in the front row. They were an island of quiet solidarity in a sea of judgment. When Clara was called to the stand, a hush fell over the room. She walked with a straight back and a steady gaze, her simple homespun dress a stark contrast to the silks and brocades of the town ladies. She looked not like a sinner, but like a queen ascending to a throne of judgment. For 2 days, she spoke Abernathy with gentle, probing questions. Led her through the labyrinth of her past. She told them everything, the happiness of her early marriage, the first hints of Elias's troubles, the coded, terrified warnings he had tried to give her, the swift and brutal machinations of Harrison and his partners. She spoke of the threats, the false evidence, the public shaming. Her voice did not break. She laid the facts bare, one by one, like cold, hard stones. But when Harrison's lawyer stood to cross-examine her, his questions turned cruel, designed to paint her as a bitter, vengeful woman of loose morals. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "is it not true that you now live on a farm with a man, Jesse Kane, who sits before you?" "Yes," Clara answered calmly. "And is it not also true that the young woman, Lena, also resides there?" "Yes. And you all live together, under one roof, as a family?" The word was a sneer. "Yes," Clara said again, her voice unwavering. "A most unusual arrangement," the lawyer mused, turning to the jury. "Tell me, Mrs. Thompson, what is your relationship to Mr. Kane?" The courtroom held its breath. This was the moment meant to destroy her, to prove she was a disreputable woman whose testimony could not be trusted. Clara looked not at the lawyer, but at the faces of the jury. Then her gaze found Jesse's. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Tell the truth." "He is my husband," Clara said, her voice ringing with a clarity and conviction that stunned the room into silence. The lawyer was taken aback. "Your husband? You have a marriage license?" "I have his heart," Clara replied. "And he has mine. We have a home we built from ruins. We have children we took in when the world abandoned them. If that is not a marriage, then I don't know what is." Her simple, profound honesty was more powerful than any legal document. It turned the lawyer's attack back on him, exposing his questions as petty and irrelevant in the face of a greater truth. The tide had turned, Abernathy followed by calling a surprise witness, a disgruntled former clerk of Harrison's whom he had tracked down, a man who had been burdened by his conscience for years. He produced ledgers and letters, corroded with age, that corroborated every detail of Clara's story. The conspiracy was laid bare, irrefutable and ugly. The verdict was a resounding victory. Harrison was found liable, his conspiracy exposed. He was ordered to pay a significant sum in damages to Clara, a public atonement for the life he had destroyed. More importantly, the court officially expunged the false charges from Elias Thompson's record. After 7 long years, his name and hers were finally cleared. As a final stipulation, to settle the damages and avoid further prosecution, Harrison was forced to sign over the deed to the Miller farm, making Jesse the legal, undisputed owner of the land he had resurrected with his own sweat and blood. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, not as pariahs, but as victors. And for the first time, the people of promise did not turn away. They looked at Clara with a new respect, a dawning understanding. They had seen her courage, had heard her truth. They remembered the woman who had braved the plague to nurse their sick, the family who had taken in orphans when no one else would. The seeds of gratitude, planted during that terrible winter, finally began to sprout. Life changed. The change was not sudden or dramatic, but a slow, gentle turning, like the changing of a season. The silence that met them in town was replaced by quiet nods, then by hesitant greetings. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, stopped Clara on the street one day and pressed a warm loaf of bread into her hands. Her eyes filled with an unspoken apology. The blacksmith offered to shoe Jesse's horse for free. People began to wave as they passed their farm. They were no longer the Kane women and their strange man. They were Jesse, Clara, and Lena. They were their neighbors. That autumn, as the cottonwoods along the creek turned a brilliant, fiery gold, they decided to have a wedding, not for the town, or the law, or the church, but for themselves. It was a simple affair, held in the meadow at sunset. There was no priest, no congregation save for the 3 children, who had picked bouquets of wild asters. Clara and Lena had spent weeks sewing their dresses from a bolt of fine white cotton, a gift left on their property stump. They walked from the house together, barefoot in the soft grass, one on each side of Jesse. Clara, his heart; Lena, his soul. He was their strength. They stood before a great, ancient oak tree. Its branches spread like sheltering arms against the crimson sky. There were no prescribed words, only the vows that came from the truths they had forged. Jesse took their hands. "I stood in this place a broken man," he said, his voice thick and steady. "You made me whole. Clara, my heart; Lena, my soul. I swear before this land that has saved us, I am yours, all that I am, and all that I have." Clara looked at him, her eyes shining. "I was a ghost, hiding from a life I was too afraid to live. You saw me. You gave me a home. I take you, Jesse, as my husband. I take you, Lena, as my wife, my sister, my heart's other half. I am yours." Lena, her face luminous in the golden light, spoke last. "I was lost, and you found me. I was afraid, and you made me safe. You taught me how to live, to love. I take you, Jesse, as my husband. I take you, Clara, as my wife, my family. I am yours." He slipped the smooth wooden rings, now worn with daily life, back onto their fingers. It was a reaffirmation, a sealing of a bond that had long since been made. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he kissed them both, a kiss of profound peace and boundless love. The story ends there, but it also begins there. It ends with the image of the 3 of them sitting together on the steps of their porch, the cool evening air settling around them. The 3 children are asleep inside. The cattle are lowing softly in the newly built barn. The stars are beginning to appear in the vast, velvet sky. They sit in a comfortable silence, their shoulders touching, watching the last sliver of golden light fade from the western plains. A man and his 2 wives, a family, not perfect by the laws of the world, but whole and complete and true by the laws of the heart. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts on the journey of Jesse, Clara, and Lena.